All right, we're on the bottom of Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, the bottom 4 lines. We were learning yesterday about the shulchan, the showbread table, and the showbread table as it was in the Temple of Solomon. And Shlomo Melech built the Beis Hamikdash. He constructed an additional 10 tables in addition to the table that Moshe Rabbeinu had built. And we saw yesterday a machlokes whether the showbread itself was placed exclusively on Moshe's table and the other tables were there for just ornament, or whether there was multiple sets of bread that were placed on all 11 tables. Okay? Now, the Gemara now also says, Tani Mizrachu Marav Hayunasunin Divrei Rabbi, Rabbi Elazar Be Reb Shimon Omer Tzafun V'Darim Hayunasunin. We have a machlokes as to how the tables were positioned. And the way that we would explain it is like this. Look, if you have an oblong hallway where the length is greater than the width, that's the heichal. Now remember, when you're walking into the heichal, what direction are you facing? West. Okay, so just remember that orientation. So if you say that the shulchan was facing east and west, it means that just like the hallway was long going down in your mind's eye, the shulchan was positioned lengthwise as well, so that its length was parallel with the lengthwiseness of the heichal. Okay, so it was positioned east and west. So that's one opinion. The other opinion is that it was positioned this way, so that when you would walk into the Beis Hamikdash and look at it, the length of the table would be perpendicular to the length of the heichal. Okay? So this is the machlokes. Was when you walked in, was it like this, or was it like this? And also, it would turn out that if you have 5 tables on one side of the main showbread table and 5 tables on the other side of the main showbread table, so then if it's lengthwise when you walk in, so then you have 5 tables coming outwards towards you and 5 tables behind it. Okay? If it's facing north and south, so that when you're looking at it, it's lengthwise is perpendicular to the length, so then you have 5 tables on this side and 5 tables on that side. So this is what's going to be difficult. The Gemara is going to raise this as a question. So Mando Arme Mizrachu Ma'irav Nicha Kulhon Ru'uyin L'Sherus. If the table is parallel, its length is parallel to the length of the heichal, so then all of the tables were therefore situated in the north side, right, which basically is the right side. When you're looking westward, north is to your right. They're all situated on the right side of that hallway. And that works out well because that's the requirement of the Torah, that the shulchan be on the north side. However, man do'amar tzafon v'darom nimsa shulchan b'darom, but if you're going to tell me that they were positioned perpendicular, so that the length of the shulchan was facing north and south, so then you had 5 tables on this side, 5 tables on this side, each shulchan is 2 amos long, so how can that be? You're invariably, the whole width of the hallway is 20 amos wide. So how can you have all of the tables positioned in the north when you have 11 tables stacked side by side lengthwise? Invariably, some of those tables are going to be positioned in the south. And that's not valid. That's not valid. Now, the Korban Ha'eda takes out the words umenora b'tzafon. That doesn't really make any sense at this point. But the point is that as we see from the Meforshim, the Gemara doesn't answer this question. This question is an ibaya de lo ifshita. It's a question that doesn't seem to have an answer. According to that Mando Amr, it's basically a kasha. Now,
if you have it on the north side, all 11 tables, how much room would there still to walk by? Is there a fair width of the heichal?
The heichal is 20 amos wide and 40 amos long.
And each table is how wide?
Each table, I think, is 2 amos wide, if I'm not mistaken.
Walk by.
Yeah.
What's the whole heichal is 40, right? So what's the parocha?
Right, the parochas which divides between the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim there's an additional 20 for the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So it's a total length of 60, up until the parochas is 40. It's 40 by 20 just in the heichal alone. Okay, so now the Gemara says, V'hatani hashulchan hayanasun mechatzi habayis v'lifnim mashuch min hakoisel beis amos umechza klafei tzafon. So this just accentuates the question, because this says that the shulchan had to be placed, if you were to draw an imaginary line down the center length of the Heichal, you would see that on the right side of that imaginary line would be called the north. On the left side of that imaginary line would be called the south. And that table was positioned on the north side, 2 amos away from the northern wall, in order to give the Kohanim an opportunity to go on both sides of the shulchan to load and to unload the bread. So that was 2.5 amos away from the wall. Umenorah kenegdo bidarom, and the menorah was opposite it on the other side of that imaginary line on this against the southern wall. Mizbeach hazahav hayanasun beemtza habayis, and then it continues and it says that the golden altar, which was also inside the heichal, which was used for burning incense, that was in the center of the heichal. So if you can imagine drawing a different imaginary line, this time cutting across the width of the heichal, bisecting it into 2 20 by 20 spaces. So they positioned the golden altar just a little bit in front of that imaginary line, facing towards the door. Okay, so that's where the golden altar was positioned. And therefore, it turns out that the golden altar, even though it was positioned at the midpoint of the length of the heichal, was thereby positioned at the first third of the entire covered structure. Right, as Rabbi Berman had just pointed out, behind the parochis was the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which extended it an additional 20 amos. So if you bisect the length of the heichal, so that the imaginary line is at the 20 amma mark, so that's a third of the way into the entire structure, which is 60 amos long.
Rabbi, the heichal is the hall in front of the Kodesh Kedoshim?
Well, the heichal is really, the heichal can be used in two ways. The heichal can be used either just as the Kodesh, or it can be referring to the entire structure of the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It was one structure that was divided by a paroches. Okay, so the Kodesh part of the heichal was 20 by 40. Behind the paroches was 20 by 20. Okay?
Is this first and second thing?
Presumably so. Yeah, it seems that way. Yeah, ArtScroll has a good diagram. And then, of course, in front of the heichal, there's that T chase, the top of the T, which is called the ulam. Also part of the same structure, but it's a wider, flares out when you first walk in.
It's more or less like 130, 40 feet.
Okay. Yeah.
This is the ulam.
He's going to be in charge of building it. When,
Okay. Yeah, we're going to put you in charge. Okay. All right. Now, we continue our discussion, just like we had a discussion of the 10 tables that Shlomo built in addition to Moshe's table. We're now going to talk about the additional 10 menorahs that Shlomo built. Eser menorahs asa Shlomo. Shlomo Melech built 10 menorahs. Shene'amar vayasas menorahs hazahav eser kemishpato. He made 10 facsimiles of the original one that Moshe Rabbeinu built. Vayitein beheichal Hashem, vayitein beheichal, rather, he placed it in the heichal. Hey miyamin v'hei mismol. 5 to the right side of the menorah and 5 to the left side of the menorah. Now, the Gemara says, let's clarify this. In Tamar chamesh b'tzafun v'chamesh b'darom. If you're going to tell me that to the right and to the left means 5 to the right side of the menorah, to the southern side of the menorah, and 5 to the northern side of the menorah, this is going to be problematic, because v'halo ein ha-menorah keshera ela b'darom. The menorah is only kosher if it's positioned in the south side, right? On the southern side, meaning on the left side, as you walk into the heichal, it's got to be all on the left side of that hallway. Shenamar ves ha-menorah nochach ha-shulchan al yerach ha-mishkan teimana. That's what the Torah basically says. It has to be on the left flank or the southern flank of the temple. So how can it possibly be that there were 5 to the left and 5 to the right? It doesn't mean to the right and to the left of the heichal. It doesn't mean you put some on the right side of the heichal, some to the left side, but rather in relation to the menorah that Moshe built, 5 were to the right of that menorah and 5 were to the left of that menorah. And presumably we'd have to explain it in the same way that we explain the Shulchan, which is that the menorah was positioned lengthwise parallel to the length of the heichal, and therefore 5 were east of it and 5 were west of it, instead of saying 5 were to the south and 5 and 5 to the north. And then the Gemara says a very parallel discussion to what we saw by the Shulchan, that the only menorah that was burned, that was lit, was the menorah that Moshe had made. Shene'amar u'menoras hazahav v'neiroseha levaer ba'erev ba'erev. As the pasuk seems to imply that the golden menorah and its candles would burn every evening, and since it's written in the singular, so you see it's only referring to one menorah, the one that Moshe made. Rabbi Yossi be Rabbi Yehuda Omer al kulan hayamavir shenemar ve'es hamenoros v'neirosehem leva'aram kimshpat lifnei hadavir, that it says in another pasuk that the menorahs in plural that were burning with their candles according to the law in front of the Holy of Holies, Zahab Sagur, that it was sealed gold. And sealed gold means that it was using the same kind of gold that Moshe Rabbeinu used. Behaperach behaneros, and the flowers and the candles, behamel kachayim, and I guess the tongs, zahavhu mechalos zahavhein. They were all made out of gold, mechalos zahav. Now what does it mean, mechalos zahav? That mechalos zahav means that it was, like from the word mechalos, from kulo, that it was completely pure gold. So kilo zahavo shel Moshe. It was like the exact kind of, it was exact facsimile, not only in form, but also material. The material that Shlomo used was also the purified gold that Moshe had used. Now, to give you an illustration of how pure the gold that Moshe used, we now have the following. Tani Rav Yehuda b'Shem Asi hayashlomo notel elef kikarei zahavu machnisan lakur umotzian adshuhu ma'amidan al aleph. That Moshe Rabbeinu would take 1,000 talents of gold, stick them in the furnace, would melt them down and keep them there so long that all of the impurities of the gold were removed to the point where you only could get out 1 talent. From 1,000 talents, you yielded 1 talent of absolutely pure and unadulterated gold. Now, I'm not a goldsmith, so I have no idea, but this sounds to me outlandish. It sounds to me like...
business.
What?
Sounds like a business.
I mean, it sounds crazy, though.
It probably wasn't very pure. The gold was mixed with other minerals.
The other gold was to start with.
Yeah, I guess so.
And also whether or not you can really have it stay, that kind of pure gold will hold its shape.
That's an interesting point also. Okay, so anyway, L'kayim Hashanamar Kikar Zahav Tahor Asa Oso, that Moshe made it out of 1 talent of pure gold. Tanya Amar Rabbi Yossi be Rabbi Yehuda Maisa be Menorah Zahav She'asa Moshe Bamidbar V'Haisa Yisera Dinar Zahav V'Hichnisu L'Kor Shmonim Pa'am V'Lo Chasra Klum. That just to give you an illustration, when using all the gold that Moshe had manufactured for the menorah, they were left over with a small amount of gold the size of a dinar. They stuck it in the oven, in the furnace, 80 separate times, and it never lost any of its volume. So that shows you that it was absolutely pure, that nothing could cause it to diminish. So the Gemara says, V'yeyos, is that really possible? How can you stick something in a furnace and there be no evaporation or whatever happens to gold when it melts? How can that be? So the Gemara says, Adelo yakum al birare hava chaser sagin, but min dav kaim al birare lo chaser klum. The Gemara says, yes, in the process of purification, when you're dealing with gold that is not 100% pure, then every time you stick it in the oven, it'll diminish somewhat. But once you've reached absolute 100%, what was that, the Dove commercial? 99 and 44 100ths pure, right? Remember that? Mm-hmm. Okay? Right? Was it Dove? Was it Dove or Ivory?
Yes.
Of course, I'm teasing as always.
Ivory.
Was it Ivory? Yeah, Ivory.
Oh, maybe it was Ivory.
Okay, we're going to argue about the commercial. All right. So anyway, so the point is that this was mamish 100% pure, and so therefore nothing at all is lost. Okay. Next, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Mishnah Shlosha Asar Shofaros Hayu B'Mikdash V'Kasav Aleihem. So there were 13 pushkas. Now remember, the word shofar means a horn because it was in the shape of a horn, an upside down horn, where the narrow end was on top and the wider end was on the bottom, on the floor. And the reason, of course, for this was you don't want anyone to stick his hand in and pull out money. What goes in stays in, and it can't come out again. Okay?
So the beginning was opposite. They changed after.
It could be, maybe. Right? Who knows? But anyway. So because of alei and taklin chadatin, so on each pushka was written something different. The first one was called taklin chadatin, the new shekels. Second one was taklin atikin, the old shekels from previous years. If you neglected to give your half shekel from previous years, you had to do a makeup and you put it into the old shekel pushka. Then the next one was called kinin, pairs of birds. The next one was called gozale ola, birds for an ola. And the Gemara will explain the difference between these two. The next one was called eitzim. If a person wanted to make a donation to purchase firewood for the altar, he would put his money there. Levona was the next one. If a person wanted to donate frankincense for people's menachos, so then he would put the money in there. Zahav la kapores was the next one, and that was for gold for kapores. And the Korban Ha'ida explains that the reason why the golden utensils in the temple, this was for purchase of golden utensils. The reason why it's called kapores is because the word lechaper not only means to atone, but it means to clean. The Kohen, whenever he would sprinkle blood, every time he would do a sprinkling of blood from his finger, he'd have to wipe his finger on a golden vessel in order to clean his finger from the previous blood, because it was no longer usable for the next sprinkling. And so that's why it's called Zahav Kapores. How many did you count? I only counted 6, but there's supposed to be 7. Let's try it again. 1 is Taklin Chadatin, 2 is Taklin Atikin, 3 is Kinin, 4 is Gozali Ola, 5 is Eitzim, 6 is Levona, 7 is Zahav Lakapor. So now we have 7, okay? And then the next 6, Shisha Linadava. The next 6 were all just standard generic Nadava, gift pushkas. And the Gemara will explain and clarify why you needed 6. Now, Taklin Chadatin Shebachol Shana V'Shana, that the one that said the new shekels was for this coming year. When you were bringing your chamachatzis shekel on time, you'd put it in that pushka. Va'atikin mishalohevi ishtakad shokol l'shana haba. The pushka for old shekels was for people who neglected to bring it previous years. They had to bring it and make it up from the previous year. Now, kinin, and you couldn't mix those two as we've learned previously. Kinin, what the pushka that was marked pairs of birds, hein torin. Those were small doves, or pigeons, I'm not sure how you translate it. Turtle doves, okay. The gozale ola hein b'nei yona. And the gozale ola, those were larger pigeons. Okay, so you have smaller doves and you have larger pigeons. And that's why you needed 2 separate pushkas, because there were 2 types of bird offerings that could be brought as gift offerings. Kulan olos, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda wants to clarify that both pushkas were for bringing carbon olas. You couldn't bring any other carbon with these pushkas except olas. Now, v'chachamim omrim, kinin echad chatas ve'echad ola. And the chachamim disagree. And they say that for the kinin pushka was if a person was obligated to bring a pair of birds, one chatas and one ola, like a woman who's given childbirth, so she could put her money in that pushka as well. And we'll explain the machlokus, why there's a machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and the chachamim on this issue. Gozale ola, kulan olos, but gozale ola, everyone agrees, was if you had to bring 2 birds as an ola, that's where it would go. Ha'omer harei alai eitzim lo yivchos mishnei gezirim. That if a person makes a pledge, and he says, I hereby pledge to bring eitzim, the word eitzim is in the plural, so that therefore you're obligated to bring at least two logs or 2 pieces of wood. Levona lo yivchos mekometz, and if you pledge to bring levona to the temple, you must bring at least a fistful of levona. And when we say, we're not talking about the raw material, we're talking about the coin equivalent, the cash equivalent of those items you deposit in the pushka. Zahav lo yivchos midinar zahav. If you pledge to bring gold, you have to give at least 1 dinar, which is the coin of gold. Shisha linadava. So the 6 that were for nadava. Nadava mahayu osin. But what would they do with the money that was collected from these 6 pushkas? Lokhin ba olos. That they would purchase animals that were going to be brought for the kayetz hamizbeach for olos, and habasar l'shem va'oros l'kohanim. And the meat went for the mizbeach, meaning after you flayed the animal, you'd burn it whole on the altar, and the hides went to the kohanim. Now this was a good gig. If you were a kohen and they were offering olos on your day, you got to keep the pelts, you got to keep the hides. That was a pretty good deal. By a shlamim, by contrast, A shlamim, part of it is eaten by the kohanim, part of it is eaten by the owner, part of it is burnt on the altar, but the hides go to the owner. So a kohen who wants hides is hoping they're going to bring olas. That'll be relevant for later. Zeh medrash darash Yehoyada kohen gadol. So the following medrash, the following exposition on a pasuk was taught by Yehoyada, the kohen gadol. He lived during the times of Melech Yehoash. As we'll see, that was a time when a great refurbishment of the temple took place. Asham hu asham asham lashem. The Torah says that when it comes to a carbon asham, it is an asham. The first part of the phrase implies that it's supposed to be brought according to its proper protocol, where part of it is eaten by humans and part of it is burnt on the mizbeach. But then the last part of the pasuk says asham lashem, that is an asham completely forgot. So how do you reconcile it? Zeh klal kol shehu ba mishum chatos u'mishum ashma yilokach bahen olos habasar lashem v'ha'oros lakohanim. That the way you reconcile it is that if a person has to bring a korban asham and he's accumulated cash for that purpose and he purchases the animal and he has leftover money that was designated for his asham, he puts that in the pushka, and what is used with that money is to purchase olas, that the carcass goes to God and the hide goes for the kohanim. And that way, basically, what you learn from that pasuk of Asham hu Asham Asham Lashem is that, number one, you have to bring the korban asham according to its protocol, but any leftover money goes completely to Hashem as a korban ola. And in the same vein, Yehoyada learned that Nimsu Shnei Ksuvim Kayamim, Asham Lashem v'Asham Lakohen. We can also reconcile two psukim, one that says that the Asham is completely for God, and the other one that says that part of the Asham goes to the Kohen, because Va'omer Kesef Asham v'Kesef Chatos Lo Yuva Beis Hashem Lakohanim Yiyu. That the money for an Asham and the money for a Chatos shall not be brought into the house of God, it shall go to the Kohanim. So what does that mean if it says that it's supposed to go for Hashem? The answer is the carcass is burnt as an ola for Hashem, and the hide goes to the Kohanim. So this is the way Yehoyada explained, and therefore he learned that when you have any surplus money from a korban asham, you bring it as an ola, which is kulo lashem, except for the hide, which goes to the Kohanim. Let us go weiter. Tanya Amar Reb Yehuda Lo Haya Shofer Shalkinim B'Yerushalayim Mipnei Hata Arovis. That the Rabbi Yehuda says the shofar for a pair of birds that a person had to bring if they were a zav or a yoledes was not placed in the Beis HaMikdash, meaning that if you needed to bring a pair of birds, you couldn't just put your money in a pushka in the Beis HaMikdash and have the Kohen take that money and use it to the birds. You had to bring the birds yourself. And why? Is because of a tarovis, because of a forbidden mixture, meaning what? Shematamus echas mehen, v'nimsu d'mechatos mesos mirovos bahen. Because we know the halacha. The halacha is that if a person sets aside money for his korban chatas and the bringer dies, then if that money gets mixed into other money, all the money must be thrown into the Yam HaMelech, into the Dead Sea. You can't get any hana from it at all. So the concern that Rabbi Yehuda has, and the reason why he says that none of the pushkas were for obligatory karbanos, is because in the event that a person would die and the money would get mixed in, then all of the money would have to be discarded. So you have to be chayshesh that maybe some of the money that's in this pushka is from a dead person, and therefore all the money is puzzle. And that's why the only money that could be put in the pushkas is money that was for olas, not for money that was for a korban chatas. So now the Gemara says v'hatanya, but one second, the Brisa seems to go against that. It says ha'isha sha'amra harei alai kain. If a woman pledges that she's going to bring a kain in order to atone for her tumah or for her childbirth, mevia demei kain v'nos naso b'shofar. She brings the money, she places it in the pushka, v'ocheles b'katshim v'eina choshes shema nisatzel bahen. She can go, and that evening she can partake in kachim with the confidence that the Kohen took care of the carbon that very day, and the Kohen also can rest assured that the person did not die. And you're allowed to assume that there's no money of dead people in there, because since the Kohanim take that money and use it right away on the very day that it's put inside the pushka, everyone can assume that the avoda is going to be taken care of that day. So the Gemara is questioning Rabbi Yehuda. Why, Rabbi Yehuda, are you choshesh for death when you see that this Brisa says that there's nothing to worry about. The Kohanim are Zrizim. They're going to use up that money almost immediately after it's deposited in the pushka. So why should you have to be choshesh that the money is going to be, the bringer of the money is going to pass away? The Gemara answers, Ki kamrinan b'chato shemesu ba'leihen vadai. So the Gemara answers, you're right. Rabbi Yehuda is not choshesh that maybe someone dies. Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that in the event when you know that someone died, it'll turn out that all the money in that pushka is going to have to be destroyed. And that Rabbi Yehuda says we wish to avoid. We don't want a situation where, listen, it's going to happen. It's going to be a rare occurrence, but it will happen once in a blue moon that someone's going to put in the coin. This woman will put in the coin, and on her way out she'll get hit by a bus, Rahman al-Islan, and before the Kohen has a chance to bring her carbon, it'll be mixed in with all the other coins, and then all the coins will have to be discarded. And Rabbi Yehuda says we want to avoid that, so we don't allow anyone who has to bring a chatas bird to deposit the money in a pushka. So now the Gemara says, V'i amrinan nivra dalet zuzi v'nishti benahara v'idach lishteru amrinan ba'alma Rabbi Yehuda lesle breira. So the Gemara says, well, I have a simple solution, says the Gemara. Why don't you just take out the amount of coins that you need for that woman's pair of birds? Just discard it. If you know she died, just take out the amount of money that she put in, and say that money is for her, and the rest of the money will be okay. The Gemara says no. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of breira. The whole concept of breira says you can retroactively say that this is her money, but we don't. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold that way. Rabbi Yehuda says it's not going to be batal, and you can't just take out the money and say it's retroactively. We say that this is the money that is set aside for her. He doesn't hold of that way, and therefore you have a bona fide ta'arovis of Isser, and there's nothing you can do. You'd have to discard all the money, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda does not allow chatos money to be put in the pushka.
How do you know any money goes to any particular korban?
How do you know? So you have to say, I mean, even, you're right, Rabbi Yehuda does, if he doesn't hold of breira, so how do you know? I guess you'd have to say that when the person puts the money in the pushka, it's nondescript, I suppose.
No, he doesn't have to have in mind the person, does he? He just offers it.
I guess he doesn't have to have in mind the person, but how are you supposed to know which money is for the chatas and which is for the ola? Probably the person puts it in and says, I'm not designating which coin is for chatas and which coin is for ola, according to the chachamim, I guess is the way it would work.
Yeah.
But according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no breira bichlal, and therefore you can't, the money's going to be permanently mixed in. Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Bon, Amar Rabbi Ba bar Mamel, Boe. The following question was asked. Amar Harei alai eitz mevi gizar echad. What we learned in the Mishnah that if a person says Harei alai eitzim, I pledge pieces of wood in the plural, the minimum is 2. He's got to bring 2 logs. What if a person says eitz in the singular? Does that mean that he can fulfill his obligation with just 1 piece, or is the minimal sacrificial amount for wood 2 pieces? So Amar Rabbi Lazar, Masnisa Amar Kain, Shezeh Karban Bifnei Atzma, V'zeh Karban Bifnei Atzma. So Rabbi Lazar says no. Each piece of wood is a separate carbon, and therefore if he says eitz in the singular, he fulfills his pledge by just bringing 1 piece of wood. Kahai de Taninan Taman, and we have a brisa to support this. Shnayim biyadam shnei gizrei eitzim carbon l'rabos esa eitzim. That the brisa says that when 2 kohanim would carry the wood, each kohen would carry 1 piece of wood in his hand to show that each piece of wood is a separate carbon unto itself. And that includes, in other words, the word carbon in the pasuk implies that even the wood itself is considered a carbon. And since 1 kohen could carry 1 piece of wood, you see that it counts as a standalone carbon unto itself. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Omar, Ovyan ama ba'ama shochekes, va'orchan ba'ama geduma. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, what was the minimal size of the log that you had to bring? What was its size? It was 1 amma thick, using a generous amma, and it was 1 amma in length, using a very minimus amma. In other words, you had to use a very small amma yardstick, meaning that you couldn't be generous. You had to have it exactly 1 amma. But its thickness, as far as how tall it would stand, it could be even a little bit larger than an amma. And Rabbi Chuni b'Shem and Rabbi Ami came in Tortani, and he says that no, the minimal requirement is that it's got to be 1 amma in its length, but it doesn't have to have any width. It could be like a stick or like a plank that is very thin, that you use. A tortini is that which you use to level off a heaping measure. So, Amar Reb Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, lefi shelo haya makam hamaracha ela ama al ama, lefichach lo haya bo ela ama geduma. The reason why they both agree that the floor, that the length, the horizontal length and width of the stick or the log could only be one very limited amma by one very limited amma, was because that's the limited amount of space that was designated on the altar for the firewood, which means that you couldn't have a longer stick because it wasn't permitted to have the firewood extend beyond a 1 amma by 1 amma square in the center of the altar. And how do we know this? Because V'tani Kain, the Brisa says, Amma hayesod, Amma sovev, Amma karkov, V'amma karnos, V'amma ma'aracha. There were a number of things related to the altar that were 1 amma wide, and one of them was the yesod, the foundational protrusion on the very bottom of the mizbeach, the sovev, which was a ledge which was in the center of the vertical height of the mizbeach, Amma Karkov, which was the perimeter where the Kohen actually walked around the perimeter of the top of the altar. Amma Karnos, the horns that were on the corners, were also 1 by 1 amma. And Amma Maracha, the place for the firewood in the center of the altar, was 1 amma by 1 amma. And therefore, when you gave the wood, it could not be longer than 1 amma in dimension. Okay, it could be a little bit thicker than an amma going upwards vertically, but horizontally, its measurements had to be 1 amma by 1 amma. Levona lo yivchos mikometz. Now, when you pledge to bring levona for the temple, you have to give at least a kometz, a fistful, meaning the value of a fistful. Nemar kan azkara v'nemar lahalan azkara, ma azkar ha'amar lahalan malo kometz, af azkar ha'amar kan malo kometz. The word azkara is mentioned by levona as should be a remembrance to Hashem for you, and the word azkara is mentioned by the korban mincha. And just like a korban mincha, you have to place a fistful on the altar, so too you have to place you have to donate a fistful of levona. So the Gemara now says, Ima azkara hamur lahalan shnei komtsin, af azkara hamur kan shnei komtsin. But wait a minute, the word azkara is also mentioned by the lechem hapanim. And there were 2 spoonfuls of levona, not just 1 fistful. And so maybe you have to bring twice, 2 fistfuls of levona to correspond to the 2 spoonfuls of levona that were on the showbread table. So Amar Rabbi Ila klum lamdu lekaimetz ela miminchas chote malahalan kometz hachaser pasel afkan kometz hachaser pasel. So the Korban Ha'eda explains that we learn out klum lamdu lekometz levona ela milechem hapanim. Actually, I'm going to learn like the Takman Chadatin, sorry. The Takman Chadatin has the girsa that we have in front of us, and he says, Rabbi Ila balistor ma dehischa lilmod milechem hapanim, v'amar klum lamdu lekometz milechem hapanim, v'chishur dekometz levana min imamincha, hein bifnei atzma. Right? He says, look, you have to be able to derive the shear of the levona from a standalone offering. The levona that's brought with the lechem hapanim is not a standalone offering. It's an accoutrement to the lechem hapanim. Whereas the mincha offering is an example of a kometz that is brought as a standalone offering. And therefore, it makes more sense to learn the shear of levona, which is in itself a standalone offering, from the standalone mincha offering, than to learn it out from the levona of the lechem hapanim, which is not standalone. Okay. Amar Rebbe Yosa, Milsa de Rebbe Ila Amra, Hamisnadev levona mevia bekumso shel kohen. He says, based on Rebbe Ila's statement that you learn it out from the korban mincha, it turns out that it's not just enough to give the value of the fistful of the bringer, but you have to give the value of the fistful of the Kohen who could potentially be bringing this korban. Which means that if I'm, let's say, a small person and I have a small fist, then it's not enough for me to measure the value of the levona based on how much levona can fit in my fist, because if I'm learning it out from the kometz of the mincha, who takes the fistful when you bring a korban mincha? Not the bringer, but a kohen. And therefore, a logic would dictate that you have to bring, I guess, an average-sized fist full to correspond to the Kohen is going to do the avoda, not to my personal-sized fist. So if I'm a tiny person, then it's not enough for me to give the value of my fistful. I have to give the value of a Kohen's fistful, the average Kohen's fistful.
These were not standardized like the Amas and...
Not at all. Rabbi Chizkiya b'shem Rabbi Yirmiyah v'afilu b'kometz haba'olam, and he disagrees, and he says no, that since it's an adava and you're donating it of your own, you can give your own size fistful. Zahav lo yivchos chulei. We said that if you pledge gold, you have to give at least a golden dinner. Amar Rabbi Lazar v'hu she'hiskir tzura, avalim lo hiskir tzura mevi afilu tzinora. That's provided when you made the pledge of gold that you mentioned the word coin. But if you didn't mention the word coin, then you could bring even a small trinket of gold that was usable to make the smallest of utensils in the temple, a tiny little fork. Okay. Shisha l'nadava. Now we have this machlokis about the 6 pushkas. The Mishnah had just told us generically that the 6 pushkas are going to be used for the purchasing of animal olas, and the hides go to the Kohanim. Chizkiya Amar keneged shisha batei avos. So Chizkiya says, why did you need 6, Dafka? He says, because when it was your week to be called up for the miluim, right, for the service as a Kohen, so you didn't work every single day. The Kohanim that were called up for that mishmar, for that shift, were divided into 6 different categories. Each one was called a Beis Av. And when it was your day to work, that's when you were on active duty. So the issue was like this. You needed 6 pushkas, one for Sunday, and there was marked the day of the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And the reason why is because if they were all put in one pushka, then here's the dilemma. Let's say today's a slow day of people needing to bring karbanos, and so there's a whole bunch of money that we're going to use for, let's say, the guys on Sunday, which is a slow day, and we're going to purchase a whole bunch of animals from this pushka to place on the Kayetz HaMizbeach. It'll turn out that the Kohanim who have a slow day get a whole big amount of hides. The guys that come in on Monday, they have a lot of people, they have a lot of customers. There's no time for the Kayetz HaMizbeach for the purchase of Ola animals, and they're only going to get a puny amount of hides. There's going to be a big machlokas it's going to break out between the Kohanim of the shift. And therefore the Chachamim in their wisdom decided, we'll only let you use the money that has your day designated on it. So that way there's an assumption that there'll be a relatively equal amount of money for each day of the week, regardless of how busy the Kohanim are on that day. Okay, so Bar Padya Amar Keneged Sheish Behemos. Bar Padya says it corresponds to the 6 different kind of animals that can be brought as an ola. Par v'egel v'soyer ayel gediu tle. That a person would have the option, because each pushka would have written the name of a different animal, not a different day of the week, but a different animal. You could either bring a par, which is a bull, you could bring an egel, a calf, you could bring a goat, you could bring a ram, you could bring a gedi, which is a goat. So a kid, a kid is a baby sa'ir, or you could bring a tle, which is a lamb or a sheep. Okay, Shmuel Amar Keneged Shisha Karbanos. Shmuel said that it corresponded to 6 different kinds of karbanos, that when a person, there were 6 different names of karbanos that would be written on the 6 pushkas, and whenever you had to bring an obligatory korban and you had surplus, you would put it into the surplus pushka for the korban that you needed to bring. So chatos, vashamos, menachos, vasiris ha'efa, and some put in the words kanezav and v'kanezaves and kaneyoldos. But basically there were 6 different names for different obligatory karbanos where you had a surplus. Amar Rabbi Yochanan al yedei shahanadava meruba ribu la shofros harbe. Rabbi Yochanan says, I disagree with all the aforementioned. It seems like he's disagreeing, and he's basically saying that no, all the pushkas were generic, and the only reason why you needed 6 was because on average there was such a huge preponderance of coins that were brought in, you needed 6 because there was so much money that was brought in. You needed to have enough pushkas to contain it. And he's going to bring an illustration or like a proof for that idea, because it says ksiv uchekalosam or shenamar uchekalosam heviu lifnei hamelech v'yahoyada. There's a discussion, there's a whole story in Sefer Menachem and in Divrei Hayamim that are parallel to each other, that in the times of King Yehoash, there was a huge collection that was taken up for the refurbishment of the temple, because Yehoash noticed that the temple was in disrepair. So he wanted to do a refurbishment project. After 30 years, the temple gets a little bit schmutzadik, worn out. And so, 30 years, it's time. I don't know if it was 30 years, maybe it was 100 years, who knows. I'm just saying, but like our shul is 30 years old, it's time for a facelift, right? So they needed to raise a lot of money in order to be able to recarpet, repaint, all these other things. No, there was no carpet, but whatever. Anyway, so they set up a pushka. They set up a big box in order to make a collection. As you're going to see, there was more than one box that was set up, and that's the purpose of bringing this in, that when there's a lot of money that needs to come in, you need to have a commensurate number of boxes for people to put the money in. Reb Shimon bar Nachman b'shem Reb Yonasan Omar, Shtei Nedavos Asa, that there were two boxes that were created in order to be able to accommodate all the donations that were brought in. And the way that we know that is because it says in the Sefer Malachim that Yehoiada took a box and he put a hole in it and he placed it by the Mizbeach. And there's another pasuk that says that he took the box and he placed it by the gate. So the only way to reconcile these two psukim is to say that there were two separate boxes. And this demonstrates that when you have a lot of money coming in, you need multiple boxes.
That's the Haftarah for Shkolim.
Okay, good. So Tani Dever Rabbi Shmuel Nedava Echas. Rabbi Shmuel disagrees with what we just said. He says there were not two separate boxes. There was only one box. Dichsiv Vayomer HaMelech Vayasu Aron Echad Vayitzneu Behechal Beis Hashem Vayikob Chur B'Dalso. As it says, they took one box and they put it by the Heichal. So now the question is, what are you going to do with that other pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, which implies that they put it by the gate? So Amar Rav Chuna mipnei hatemeim, that really it was the same box. They originally Yehoiada put it inside the temple, and Yehoash said, no, by putting it inside the temple, the people who are tamei are not going to have the opportunity to make their donation. So he told them to move that self-same box and put it outside by the gate. Rabbi Chanina b'shem Rabbi Yosef, ach lo ye'asa beis Hashem, sapos kesef mizamros. According to the Korban Ha'ida, he is coming to disagree, and he's coming to say that there were taka two pushkas. One pushka was for the clay shares, was for ministering vessels, and the other pushka was for the refurbishment of the structure itself, for the edifice. And that's why you needed to have two pushkas, because they were for two different kinds of donations. Have a wonderful day.